Hi, I'm Bryn Griffiths, your Labour Left podcast host, and today I'm delighted to welcome Mark Perryman of Lewis Labour Party, who's just published what I think is the best book on the Starmer government yet, The Starmer Symptom. Mark comes from a different political place to me, so I'm really looking forward to our discussion. In the 1980s, while I was supporting Tony Benn alongside Jeremy Corbyn and selling Brighton Labour Briefing in my local Labour Party, Mark was a member of the Communist Party and part of the Marxism Today team, which I have to say was occasionally unimpressed by those of us on the Labour left. Today, I think I've noticed in all the conversations I've had with Mark over the last year or so that our political paths seem to be converging. But let's see. How are you doing, Mark?
I'm doing very well, and thank you for that introduction.
So let's start off with some basics. I don't think you can really grasp what this book is about without recognising there's something about Marxism Today going on in the background. For your younger listeners, can you explain what the Communist Party's Marxism Today was, why it was so important, and why at times it provoked such furious debate in the 1980s and up to the day it closed in 1992? What were you up to?
Well, officially, it was a theoretical and discussion journal of the Communist Party, which was founded in 1956, or just after 1956, as a specific response to the something like 10,000 members who left over the invasion of Hungary to create a more pluralistic culture within a Marxist-Leninist party. By the late 1970s, it had changed dramatically. Martin Jakes had taken over as editor. And in January 1979, probably one of the most important articles of the magazine was published, which was The Great Moving Rights Show by Stuart Hall. Unfortunately, The Great Moving Rights Show proved to be a great success only 5 months after the publication of Stuart's essay. Margaret Thatcher has returned as Prime Minister. Thatcherism was something quite different to what any of us had experienced before. That Martin Jakes, who's the editor, and Stuart Hall, the principal writer, identified Thatcher as a different kind of brand of conservatism to what we'd experienced before.
So let's explore the breadth of the alliances that Marxism Today was proposing at the time. When I read your article in The Starmer Symptom, I thought it was one of the best articles, actually. And you had that strapline, which I always hear you using when you're not eulogizing about organic intellectuals, which I'm up for. You always say, "My front is popular." Could you explain to the listeners what are you talking about when you say "my front is popular"?
Well, I've kind of nicked it because in the 80s there was a intellectual kind of newsletter of people broadly in favour of tactical voting called Samizdat, and they called themselves, their strapline was a popular front of the mind, which is neat. I've just kind of shortened it. My front is popular, but I don't see these barriers. So I cited in my essay, my keynote chapter, David Wishery, a leading member and dissident member of the Socialist Workers' Party. He was the brains behind Rock Against Racism. His book, Beating Time on Rock Against Racism, which has been long out of print. I've been trying to persuade a number of publishers to reissue it. It's just a textbook of how a political cultural movement can be built, and it's brilliantly designed. It's sort of fanzine style, and he has this great phrase, "against miserabilism," and it absolutely exemplifies Rock Against Racism, because the National Front, like Tommy Robinson et al., is enough to make anybody miserable. It was polling above the Liberal Democrats ahead of the 79 general election, or in those days the Liberals, in the GLC elections. It was a real threat. Even in those circumstances, he would argue against miserabilism. And I've actually put my bookmark in because I thought this might come up. He had no time for those on our side who couldn't grasp the significance of Rock Against Racism. And this is the quote from David Wishery: "Marxists who turn socialism into something as obscure as particle mechanics." And I know exactly the Socialist Workers' Party intellectual he was thinking of at the time, Alex Kalinikos. But people can inspire like that. and they're worth engaging with. So let's be plural. And similarly, we might differ, but Labour, Torsten Bell on the Labour Fringe this week described Ed Davey as a fat man in a wetsuit. Now, Labour withdrew from seats like mine, Lewis. They told us not to campaign because there was no chance of Labour winning in Lewis. And the Liberal Democrats did more or less the same in almost every seat. So if we're going to hang on in 2029, we need those Liberal Democrat seats to be held and not to go to the Tories. So it's so immature.
I just want to explore this Popular Front a bit more. Like the Anti-Nazi League and Rock Against Racism, I completely get. I'm at school on the side of the Pennines in Colne Valley. Richard Wainwright's seat, he was the dad of Hilary Wainwright, who you probably know.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
So there I am on the side of the Pennines. I thought in the middle of nowhere, desperate to go to university. And me and my mates were getting our hands on Anti-Nazi League leaflets from guys handing them out in Oldham and handing them out at school. And we're playing Tom Robinson, Glad to Be Gay. And nobody was out in the whole of bloody sixth form, but we're all singing Glad to Be Gay in the sixth form. So it was just, it was quite a moment. And I completely agree with you about that opposition to miserableism. Like, we knew to be part of the Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League was to be cool. And I think that's a really important thing for the left. But then Bryn gets a bit older, goes to Sussex University. And the first time I come across what was supposed to be a Popular Front was I turn up, rock up at university, and it was great. I'm no longer on the side of the Pennines, and I'm faced with this university where there was anarchists, libertarian socialists, various varieties of Trotskyists, a Labour Student Society that was resolutely Bennite, which I obviously joined instantly. But then on the right, there was a broad left populated by liberals and communists. And the only people further to the right on campus were the Federation of Conservative Students, and they wanted to hang Nelson Mandela. So my first sort of contact with this notion of the Popular Front was the Liberals, the Communist Party lashed up with the Liberals, sort of to the right of the Labour students on campus that were Bennite. And to be honest, I didn't quite like the look of it.
The leadership of the National Union students was the broad left, which was Labour students, Liberal Democrats and the Communist Party, plus non-aligneds. And then what happened was Labour students left that and fought and contested the NUS elections on their own. And the Communist Party were left with the Liberal Democrats and non-aligneds in what was called the Left Alliance, and it was led by David Aronovich. I'm not saying that every single example of pluralism has been spot on. Sometimes we get it wrong. But as a principle, working with others for the common cause, that seems to me absolutely right. I mean, when I worked for the Marxism Today, the Communist Party just moved out of King Street, which was its famous headquarters for decades, and moved to St John Street. And I would go into work, and a chap by the name of Phil Paratin would be coming in. And his book, Our Flag Stays Red, is like a textbook of how to build a popular movement, a popular front against the fascists. And it's that kind of thing. It's something to inspire, but it's not to follow every single dot and comma of it.
There's something that I want to explore that really intrigues me about your politics, the approach to your political education events in Lewis, and indeed your book, The Starmer Symptom, is you've probably picked up that when I hear Popular Front, I expect to hear something that is looking to our right and policing ferociously the left flank. But you have admirers. Like, I was just reading various reviews of your book to prepare for this interview, and I read Pat Stack, who used to write Stack on the Back on the Socialist Workers Theoretical magazine, described you as unusual in Euro-communist circles by being interested in and to a degree receptive to arguments to your left as well as your right. And then, perhaps even more surprisingly, one of your probably one of your opponents, I imagine, when you were in the Communist Party, Andrew Murray of the Communist Party of Britain, let's call it a Stalinist tradition, the Morning Star, said probably the most stimulating thinker associated with the Euro-communist wing of the old Communist Party of Great Britain. And then to include myself as a sort of junior representative of the old Labour left Bennite tradition, you quote me good self in your book, waxing lyrical about your openness and pluralism at your Lewis political events. Now, you strike me as unusual coming from your political tradition, that your pluralism does not only stretch rightwards, but it also stretches leftwards.
Yeah, I'm not sure how vibrant that tradition is now. Obviously we've seen the relaunch of the soft left and the Labour Party through mainstream, and we'll see how that might develop. And clearly one of the figures most associated with mainstream is Clive Lewis. And he's both a member of the Socialist Campaign Group and he's extremely active in Compass, and I'm sure will be active in mainstream. So I think there is some of that around. I mean, I'm interested in individuals' ideas that make things happen, and I'm interested in practical politics, campaigning politics. You can't really have an interest in that and ignore people to the left of the Labour Party, because that's where it's emerged from. One of our jokey lines for our events in Lewis is, all welcome, our only entry criteria is an open mind.
Let's talk about Gramsci. The book's title hits us with Gramsci between the eyes. Why did you choose the Starmer Symptom as your title?
A Labour Party member, regular at our events, an economist, Peter Holmes, and he emailed me and said, I'm really not sure about that title. You should have chosen the Starmer Paradox. I thought, God, yeah, really good. We'd done the Blair Agenda. I edited the Blair Agenda. That was a Signs of the Times book. Came out, I think it was in about 94, so before the general election. And then I'd done the Corbyn Effect in 2018. So I was looking for something where we had the name and what could go with it. And Oliver Eagleton, I've got to admit, I don't think it's a very good book. It's like a diatribe of conspiracy theories, the Starmer Project. So he'd nabbed that one. So I was kind of hunting around, and I quite liked. Obviously, it connected to the Gramsci quote.
The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear.
Apart from pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, it's probably one of the most famous quotes from Gramsci. And what I then go on to explain is that actually the translation is wrong. There's an academic I quote called Gilbert Akachar, and actually Gramsci wrote the phenomenon, a great variety of morbid phenomena appear. So, which is much less loaded than symptoms. Symptoms suggest to me illness, something going horribly wrong. And definitely Starmer is a symptom of something or other. And where I locate him is in a crisis of Labourism, and that Labourism is this great bugbear that the Labour Party carries. And I would say that Jeremy Corbyn is as much wedded to Labourism, or almost in different ways, as Starmer. You know, there's very few elements, apart from the sort of dissenting elements, who don't quite fit the Labour mould. And I would say that Clive Lewis doesn't fit the Labour mould in that sense. And there's precious few other, Nadia Whitcomb as well. I think they're very different to most Labour MPs in the Socialist Campaign Group. And I describe it as testing the limits of Labourism. And I conclude the chapter. I didn't open it with this because it kind of gives you the answer before you get to the end. We need to test the limits of Labourism to destruction. You know, we need to destroy Labourism. And that's the only way that Labour will really emerge as a radical and election-winning party.
So what is Labourism?
Well, there's a number of theorists, critical theorists of Labourism. One is Ralph Miliband, another would be Raymond Williams, and a third would be Stuart Hall. What is the one thing that all members of the Labour Party have in common? The one thing they all have in common is they have an interest in politics of a broadly social democratic leaning. When I do events about this book and previous books, so many times people have come up, Mark, we came to our Labour Party meeting. We discussed politics. We don't do that very often. So Labourism is a contempt for ideas. Labourism cannot confront the forces of opposition in any forum apart from Parliament. It doesn't, and through the party political with a capital P, it doesn't confront the forces of opposition on the cultural front, and culture in the widest sense of the word. Now, as Raymond Williams brilliantly put it, is culture is politics. That is so far away from the Labour Party.
You're articulating a commitment to pluralism. You're articulating an approach where political ideas and coalition building is very important. So let's now try and apply some of that stuff to what's written in your book. Let's start with Paula Surridge, who's one of your authors and a contributor to the British general election of 2024. So she knows a bit about psephology. And she pointed out that in 24, the general election victory that we had was delivered on the lowest winning vote share on record. And she asked in her chapter, did Labour win or did the Tories lose? What does that tell us about the coalitions we need to build to win?
What Paula is talking about there, and I'd be surprised if this isn't widely understood, but maybe not the full meaning of it, is Labour's vote share was round about 33%. There's been no government elected on such a low vote share. And the only answer to that, and it sounds like you're a convert to it, Bryn, is proportional representation. Absolutely. If there'd been proportional representation, then Labour would have probably got about 40% of the House of Commons, and wouldn't have been able to govern on its own. And it would need to govern with those 72 Liberal Democrat MPs. Probably wouldn't have needed the Greens or the Independents. So it's absolutely clear, Labour would not have won if Reform had stood down in the way the Brexit Party stood down in 2019. Corbyn would have probably been elected if the Brexit Party has stood in the same way Reform has stood this time round. So it absolutely, and of course, I used to argue, I think it was at one of our events actually, and I wasn't booed, but people looked at me rather aghast. I said, who is the most important ally in the campaign for proportional representation? Nigel Farage, because he was an absolute champion of proportional representation. I think he wrote a short book on it even. Now he's not interested at all. The caliber of the man is unbelievable. The lowness of the caliber of the man. But proportional representation is absolutely vital for us to have fair elections. That's not the way to defeat. Labour supported proportional representation will probably save some seats. Maybe in some of the urban metropolitan areas, but it's the future of British democracy, and it's the one issue that unites John McDonnell and Luke Akehurst.
Paul is telling us that we won a shallow, wide majority. Yeah. So she says, in quite a scary rebuttal of the McSweeney strategy, she says that the concern for Labour must be that if the focus shifts back to Brexit, immigration and culture wars, as it might do, while the economic security and cost of living crisis continues under the new government, the weaknesses of the hero voters, that's the Conservative swing voters that McSweeney the chief of staff in Starmer's office identifies, the weakness of the hero voters' support may be revealed. So how do we respond to that?
Wow. I haven't got all the answers. Yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, Labour is going to be squeezed in two different directions. You know, this isn't a particularly original observation, but it's going to lose votes to the Lib Dems. It's going to lose votes to the Greens. It's going to lose votes to the Independents, possibly your party. If you look at the majorities, it's not going to lose many seats, but it will lose some seats to the left. And it's clearly going to lose some seats to the right. At the moment, it's difficult to see a way. It's quite a way off 2029, isn't it? It's difficult way to see that Labour can recover. Its position in the polls. I think we're probably hoping, and those of the religious persuasion praying, that Farage will explode. And the mythology will be torn asunder. If there's some kind of electoral pact between Reform and the Tories, which I think at the moment is unlikely, but I don't think it's inconceivable, then I think it's almost impossible to see a road to Labour winning.
Danny Dorling at one of your events, How to Transform Unequal Britain, scared me to death, because he pointed out that even an informal pincer movement, if it could be arranged by the Conservatives and Reform, where the Conservatives focus on going for us in the traditional Conservative heartlands, and the Conservatives leave Reform to go for us in areas like the Red Wall seats. Even if it was an informal agreement like Labour had to an extent with the Liberals at the last general election, that could be deadly. John McDonnell's talking about the Labour Party possibly facing an existential moment where the party's very existence might be at stake. Do you think he's right?
I think it's a lot easier. Like the Starmer Symptom is mainly about the past and the present, and it's a lot more difficult to be certain about the future. Right now, certainly any kind of pact of the type that Danny Dorling is describing, which isn't a formal pact, but basically you put your efforts, or the Labour Party described as non-battleground seats. So my seat, Lewis, where Labour has never ever returned an MP and has been third, he's never been better than third or fourth. You don't put any effort in there, and you put the effort where you can win. I think that, particularly if Jenrick becomes is a real possibility. I think Farage has got a huge record of effing things up. So I think that is possible.
Like the chickens have come home to roost, because the pundits, and indeed more Labour Party members, suddenly seem to have discovered the awful political culture that we have in the party at the moment. Before we explore that, let's have a look at Faiza Shaheen's Newsnight moment in the 2024 election. And I want you to be thinking about Emma Burnell of Labour List, one of your contributors, who talked about Labour according to McSweeney. Let's see Faiza.
Yeah, Faiza Shaheen, thank you for talking to us. Are you the Labour candidate for Chingford and Woodford Green?
Well, I thought I was, and then I literally just got an email, so I'm just in a bit of a state of shock, to be honest. I've worked that seat for a long time. I just had a baby. I went back, I had a C-section. I was on doors knocking 6 weeks after my baby was born. I have put so much effort into that seat. So many people know me. You walk around tonight, 40, 50 people turned up to help me canvass. There's posters all over. There's hundreds of posters that are already on people's windows. You go in the coffee shop, you see my leaflets. There were people that came to door knock for me that were kids from the local schools, because I go and speak at all the local schools. It's my area. I grew up there. It's my school. My hospital that I was born in, it's my community. I'm just in a state of shock, to be honest.
So you got an email tonight. When?
Just like an hour ago.
Saying.
So basically, suddenly I'm I'm out campaigning and my phone's blowing up. They've briefed the press. They briefed the press before they even had the decency to call me and talk to me. There was a meeting yesterday. My baby cried through half of it, so I don't know how they came to a decision, because I couldn't even hear their questions. 14 tweets since 2014, 10 years. 3 of those were like about the Green Party, me liking my friend tweet before I joined the Labour Party. And one of them was about my experiences of Islamophobia in the party. Like, how am I not allowed to talk about my experiences of Islamophobia and the double standards that I've seen and that we see with Diane Abbott, for instance? I honestly, I'm just so shocked right now to be treated this badly after being such an active member of the party. And, we were one of the tiny number, 6 Tory-held seats in 2019 that had a swing to Labour. To act like I am some kind of person that can't, that isn't good at elections, that frustrates the Labour's purpose.
For the benefit of the National Constitutional Committee, if they're watching, Pfizer gave this interview when she was still a Labour Party member. We are not commenting on any decisions that Pfizer has subsequently made. We're recalling how we felt as Labour Party members when we returned from canvassing to watch this interview on Newsnight in the middle of the general election. I'm sure listeners will understand why I've made that statement. So, Mark, what does that clip of Pfizer sort of visibly upset, describing how she's been nobbled as a parliamentary candidate, tell us about our internal culture?
It was in the 2019 general election where, Labour had a pretty disastrous campaign, and she was one of the very, very few candidates who reduced the majority of their Tory opponent, and a very high-profile Tory opponent, former leader of the party. So she's clearly an incredibly dynamic candidate, but like so many, she wasn't the right kind of candidate for Morgan McSweeney and his mob. And, Michael Crick absolutely catalogued this, time after time after time. People didn't go on the shortlist. A good friend of mine didn't go on the shortlist in East Worthing. Another one didn't go on the shortlist in Hastings. So we've got local examples of this as well. And those were both won by Labour, but they could have been won by really good, strong local candidates. And they were, what they did was they removed these. It's slightly different with Faiza Shaheen. Removing strong local candidates from the shortlist because they know in the local members' ballot they would have won. And it's despicable. And it's top down and it's factional. How do you prevent that? Well, always. I think you and I have something else that we agree on is that the only people who celebrate when people leave the Labour Party to the left are the right. Now I'm not disagreeing with people who leave the Labour Party. I can absolutely understand it. And I happen to live somewhere where it's a pretty amicable local party. There's things that I can do which I think are helpful and which I enjoy, and I can be an activist. But I always say the Labour Party membership card's in my back pocket. The Labour Party doesn't tell me what to think. It doesn't stop me doing what I believe in. And when they do, I'll defy them and I'll be expelled. It's as simple as that. So they don't tell me what they try to tell me what to think about Palestine. It makes not one iota of difference in terms of what I think about the genocide in Gaza. But Labour Party is not very good at pluralism, anything but. I think historically that's applied to the left as well as the right. I think that's beginning to change. The fact we're having this kind of conversation is because you described your background and you've described my background for me, and they seem to be within the orbit of the left, polar opposites. But there's a conversation going on there. And also what's happened is Starmer has pushed people out like Louise Hay. I think Angela Rayner will come back. I think she will come back at some point. I think that was one, if I was being cynical, that's why all these nice words are being said by people like Reid and Streeting in conference. Oh, we so miss you, Angela. We really wish you were here. No, they don't. And yeah, of course, she compromised under Starmer, far more than any of us would want her to do. But that is to do with collective cabinet accountability and collective responsibility.
I come from a constituency next to Angela Rayner's, and her life story and the way she used to perform under Jeremy meant that I feel positively disposed to her.
Yeah.
I think she went way beyond collective responsibility.
Yeah.
Said at the Labour Friends of Israel that she would support thousands of Labour Party members being expelled if that was necessary. I think that.
No.
I think that goes. I think Miliband is showing how you can still have a dissident voice but maintain collective responsibility. I think Angela.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that Ed Miliband and Lisa Nandy both back Lucy Powell, because that's got to be, if Lucy Powell beats Bridget Phillipson, which I hope she does, that's going to create an incredible breakdown of relations within the cabinet of senior cabinet ministers. I don't think Bridget Phillipson will forgive them very easily. If Lucy Powell does win, that's another signifier that, we've supposedly lost 200,000 members, so we're probably down to about 200,000. But that membership is not as politically homogeneous in terms of a Starmerite mould as people might assume.
Just on Lucy Powell, I think that her victory possibly been a signifier of dissent to the way the party has been run is the best argument that can be put for her, because on all the issues that we've had under the Labour government of winter fuel allowance, disability benefits, third child benefits, Gaza, she has been in lockstep with Keir Starmer. I cannot see that on.
Yeah, but I think what you described as a consequence is a good enough reason. This is one of the, you don't get that many votes as a Labour Party member. This is an opportunity to say, we don't agree with the direction that Starmer has taken the Labour Party in. There's only one candidate you can vote for to express that point of view. You're not being asked to say Lucy Powell is the socialist saviour of the Labour Party.
That brings the first half to a close very well. I think that sort of summary that you just made there. And we'll come back in the second half to talk about strategy. If you're enjoying the interview, please subscribe on YouTube or your favourite podcast platform. You can then delve into our back catalogue of shows, which are all still well worth watching. My next guest in November will be Socialist Campaign Group's Bel Ribeiro Addy, so look out for that. Listener numbers on the Labour Left podcast are on the up. But to help us reach a wider audience, please can you like and follow the podcast wherever you watch or listen to the show. All comments, even critical ones, draw the podcast to the attention of a wider potential audience. Please, please, please share it with your friends on your socials, your local WhatsApp groups, as it gets the podcast to a wider audience. Finally, check out Labour Hub for the best Labour Left news updates on the internet. Now back to Mark for a deep dive into today's Labour Party. Welcome back after the break. I want to try something out on you, Mark. I always thought that the ideas behind Marxism Today always tended to be strong on diagnosis, but less so on prescription. And I think you've done a fantastic job in the Starmer Symptom, if I can use the title, of working out what Starmer's sickly symptoms are. Fantastic contribution to our understanding of Starmer and the Starmer moment. But I was left thinking, okay, that's pretty bad. What should I do now? Am I fair to come away with that thought?
I think a little unfair on both fronts, actually. Marxism Today took a decision prior to the 1987 general election, but it wouldn't initiate a debate like it did with Thatcherism following 79, and Labour's lost millions following 83. We didn't initiate a debate on where is politics, economy, and society going, which was the New Times debate. And that was incredibly influential and successful. And it really carried the magazine through from 87 till the end. 89 then comes in with the fall of the Soviet Union, and that's another sort of departure of the magazine. In terms of a book, Yeah, I mean, the book is divided into 4 parts, but even the first part, which is mapping the vote, there's the essay by Joe Kennedy, which I would say is pretty forward-looking, and it's also sort of prescriptive isn't quite the right word, but it's analytical in the sense of, look, his idea of authentocracy, which we've had from Starmer, and I don't know how many times Bridget Phillipson has mentioned the fact she grew up in a council house, and doesn't seem to mention that she went to Oxbridge following that, which is great success, laudable and a great academic success on her part, but it changes your class standing if you've been to Oxbridge. Then the second part is the outcomes in terms of the chapters by Joe Mulhall on the populist right and Hilary Wainwright on the sort of outer left. They're both very forward-looking. And then the last half of the book is all forward-looking. I think it is quite prescriptive in terms of ideas. I think Andrew Sims' chapter on the climate emergency, Jess Garland's on electoral reform, James Medway's on the economy, Danny Dorning's on inequality. Then the very last chapter by Eunice Goes on radical, pragmatic, social democratic. So I don't think you're being entirely fair on the book.
It's not so much about looking forward as about, what is the strategy that we need to put in place as the left.
My chapter both analyses what Labourism is and, how you can break it down. Like I say, I want to test the limits of Labourism to destruction, and I sort of list all these different examples. Eunice's chapter, like I said, on radical, pragmatic, social democratic. I think there's quite a good range there, but yeah, I think generally the left is better at analysing than prescribing, isn't it?
One of the chapters that jumped out at me that I thought got right to the heart of the matter was Danny Dorling's.
Yeah.
When he talks about child poverty and distribution, and his chapter, How to Transform an Unequal Britain. I cannot see how Labour can win if we allow things like child poverty and unequal distribution of wealth to stay as it is. I think that I interviewed Professor Harvey J. Kaye, an American academic, and he spoke about lessons from America, and he talked about an economic bill of rights, and he said that the Democrats telling the electorate that the economy was getting better just didn't wash if people didn't feel it in their daily lives. Mm. And he talked about an economic bill of rights that addressed the economic condition of the Democrats' core voters. Now, I thought Danny was getting close to it with that. I felt I could see some strategy there but if Labour's going to stick with we can't have redistributive taxation, I don't see how we can deliver that important part of a winning coalition for Labour.
I don't disagree with you. I think, I don't know, I wasn't in Liverpool. I'm sort of going by the news reports. I get a sense that the Labour Party is not as tin-eared as it has been. It's aware that there needs to be a shift, but it's whether it's intellectually and politically capable of making that shift. And the same people are in place, in particular Starmer and Reeves, and you think, are they really going to make that shift? And Reeves, in some ways, is more important than Starmer for precisely the reasons you explain. Because if they're going to make that shift, either she's got to make it or she's going to have to be resign or sacked. Just go back to Danny. I mean, we've had him twice in Lewis. He's not only a brilliant writer, he's a fantastic communicator. I asked, do you get invited to many Labour Party meetings, to do events? He said, no, only yours, Mark. He should be up and, local Labour parties should be organising events with people like Danny Dorling. He's not a minister, he's not an MP, but he's got the ideas, and he would provoke a debate, I would imagine he was speaking on the conference fringe, but maybe he wasn't, He
was in John McDonnell's extended list of academics that he was engaging, which I thought was very positive. I thought that his chapter on child poverty that explained what the failure to remove the third child benefit cap was going to be. He talked about how Britain was performing in terms of child poverty. He compared us unfavourably to Scotland, where the Scottish Parliament has taken a different stance.
Yeah.
I thought that, yes, I strongly recommend anyone's listening, get hold of Danny Dorling and get him into your constituency.
When we had him with Polly Toynbee, and people thought these are polar opposites, they weren't polar opposites at all. There was so much of an overlap, which gives you an idea of the kind of coalitions, a popular front of the mind, if you like, that you can build.
But what left me depressed about that session, which was excellent, by the way, and Danny was particularly excellent when you were talking about a strategy for an unequal Britain in Lewis.
Yeah.
I thought Polly Toynbee was absolutely spot on in her honesty when she said that all the things that Labour need to be delivering rest upon the magic growth tree. And if the magic growth tree doesn't deliver for Rachel Reeves, we're going to get knout. And I wrote before the general election even took place for the Campaign for Labour Party Democracy's campaign briefing, where I predicted that once it was set in stone that we weren't going to have a redistributive economic policy, it was only going to end the way that the government's going now. That where is them? If you're not going to redistribute in the context of a war in Ukraine, the COVID sort of effect, Brexit, and the decline of the British economy, if you aren't going to redistribute and the magic growth tree doesn't deliver, Labour is not going to deliver its promises. One of your contributors in your book, Neal Lawson, who's also a former Labour Left podcast guest, has been instrumental in the launch of Mainstream, a new soft left grouping within the party. I'll start off by saying, do you think that Mainstream sounds... I keep pushing you on, well, what's the strategy then? What do we do? Is Mainstream, to some extent, the operationalisation of the ideas behind your book?
I think that's too early to say.
Well, let's get a different way. If it was going to be, what does it have to do?
I think it has to decide whether it's a pseudo-faction, in the way that Open Labour has been, not very successfully, or does it seek to win the battle of ideas within the Labour Party? I would tend to go for the latter. I think there's limited time and resources. I think I've only recently joined Compass. I had sort of various, a lot of warmth toward Neal Lawson, and he as a person and politically, but it just didn't quite ring a bell for me, Compass. And I wasn't involved with, I obviously wasn't involved with Labour coordinating because I wasn't a member of the Labour Party. But there was a kind of relationship though between Marxism Today and Labour Coordinating Committee, particularly through the offices, in every sense of the word, of Robin Cook. And when then the Labour Coordinating Committee became Compass, and I know at the time there were a lot of Labour Party people really annoyed about this. And I think, actually everything needs to be thrown at the Labour Party right now. So I'm not sure you can sort of run two organisations. There's limited resources and time because there's a lot of overlap between the two. And then you've got to decide what does Mainstream have the numbers to organise a slate for the NEC and that kind of thing. I don't think it does. I'm not sure if the people who joined have that kind of mentality. I mean, you know far more about this than me in the campaign for Labour Party democracy. But winning the battle of ideas, I think they can. And obviously, if you win the battle of ideas, then all things being equal, you should win those inner party elections as well.
Let me push back on that, Mark. I don't think the problem that we've got is fundamentally a problem of ideas. I think we've got a leadership that is run by a faction that is probably the most internally authoritarian leadership the Labour Party's ever had, which is quite a high bar, but I think they've got over it. I think that the people around Morgan-McSweeney cut their teeth on defeating people like you and I, and have proved to be, credit where credit's due, very adept at beating the left internally. But their strategy for the general election seems to be, at one and the same time, park their tank on Farage's lawn by showing that they're going to be tough on immigration as well, whilst trying to terrify the electorate into voting Labour on the grounds that if you don't vote for us, look what you're going to get. Nothing that you're suggesting is going to change. And we're not, in my view, going to save the Labour Party in time unless we have some form of change of leadership. If we don't have that, the chance of Starmer's faction reinventing itself in anything like the way you're suggesting is next to nil. So how can you avoid the need, let's say it, with somebody like Burnham to replace Starmer? How can we not do that if we want to save the Labour Party before the next general election?
Okay, it's a question of taking a very hard-headed view when you assess the numbers who signed up to mainstream, the commitment those people have, how embedded they are in their constituency parties, the skills that they have, whether they're able to do that. Momentum were able to do that for a period. Labour to win are clearly capable of doing that. If mainstream can do that, then good luck. Get on with it, definitely. I'm just a little bit doubtful whether they have the numbers and have the organisation, have the skills to do that. And if you haven't, then win the battle of ideas first, because that will draw people to you. And then in terms of the leadership challenge, the only seat that Andy Burnham will win is a Manchester seat. So that reduces the number of constituencies, I don't know, to 10, 15, 20 at the most. There is absolutely no reason why McSweeney will allow Andy Burnham to be a candidate. Now, there obviously will be a huge row, but there's nothing that Burnham can do to stop McSweeney preventing him being a candidate. So I just cannot see that as the route to deposing Keir Starmer. If Starmer sort of says to Morgan, look, I've just had enough of this, I've got to go. Would McSweeney then go with him? But again, the timetable would be that Burnham isn't already an MP. He needs to be an MP before Keir Starmer decides to fall on his sword. I just can't see it. Can't see it happening.
My problem is that with the wide but shallow majority that we've got, if there's going to be no change on economic policy, my fear is that the PLP is marching towards a cliff edge. And on the first past the post, we will hit a tipping point where first past the post benefited us enormously at the last election. At the next one, if we carry on as we are, we could fall over the cliff and face that existential threat that John McDonnell's talking about.
I'm not trying to depress you or those people watching this show, but I think I don't think it's because I'm cleverer than anybody else. I definitely don't think that. But I cannot understand why journalists don't articulate exactly what I'm saying, that the chances of Andy Burnham becoming an MP in a time frame which would lead to him challenging for the leadership, I would say not next to zero, close to zero. Similarly, the chances of the Greens and your party both getting into much more than double figures of MPs, which would be a breakthrough for the Greens, by the way. They go from, I think it's 4, isn't it, to 10. That's doubling their number, but they are not going to be a significant force in Parliament. They could be a significant force as part of a coalition. That's just how it is. So, if Starmer fell on his sword, what would happen if Angela Rayner stood for the leadership?
You're painting a picture, which I think is fairly accurate, of a party leadership that isn't for changing direction, an internal regime that's more authoritarian than we've seen before. We're marching towards a dangerous cliff edge. And to add to our difficulties, we're going to start losing votes to the left, to the Greens and Zara and Jeremy's new party. So how do we beat reform?
First of all, I wouldn't underestimate the possibilities of an implosion in terms of reform. We've not talked about Advance, which is the sort of bit that thinks that reform are a bit left-wing. They've got 30,000 members, as I understand it, already. I suspect that's more than your party have got. They So it could well be a split vote. I think there is the possibility that people will recoil. I don't want to say it's a silent majority, but, the sort of the flag shaggers and painters of roundabouts with St George crosses and so on, I'm not sure how many people they represent. And I think Starmer began to challenge back this week. I think it's slightly contradictory Mahmood's speech, which seemed to be of a very different calibre. Maybe the two expect it, good cop, bad cop, if you like. But, he's clearly either alerted himself to this or been riled or whatever. And I don't think Starmer's a very effective, I think he's not a very effective communicator at all. He's a poor public speaker for somebody, when people say you have forensic analysis doesn't inspire anybody. And that's where Angela scores so much more highly. I think Streeting is probably a better communicator. I hate to admit it, but he's a better communicator. There's an anger about him, and he seems to be, seems to be something more genuine behind it or something. I don't think we're looking at a very happy situation. We've not talked about north of the border. There's going to be an SNP revival. I'm a follower of Tom Nairn. I can't wait until when Scotland and Wales get independence. I believe in the breakup of Britain, but it doesn't suit the British parliamentary system at all, because the SNP won't go to 10. They could go to 40 or 50 MPs. They would be potentially, they would be the third or fourth largest party in Parliament. If the polls are right, Labour is not going to have a lot more MPs than the Liberal Democrats and the SNP. So we're looking at this is why, opposition to proportional representation is lunacy. I mean, Labour, of course, could legislate for proportional representation very quickly. There'd be a huge row about it, but that's the advantage you got when you've got a massive majority. They brought in votes for 16. They could decide we're bringing electoral reform before the next general election and throw everything out the window, wouldn't it?
I fear that somebody like Morgan McSweeney is hell-bent on a form of Russian roulette, where he thinks that the way through is to scare people, which I think Starmer did quite articulately this week, that with the alternative to voting Labour, however disappointed or cross you might be, is reform. He thinks that's the way through, and nothing on earth's going to persuade him to support proportional representation. I think I'm saying that the logjam in terms of coalition building, internal party culture, in terms of economic policy, in terms of PR, in terms of openness to work with other parties, that logjam does not break up until we have a change of leadership.
Almost the entire debate about the change of leadership for the last few weeks has been about Andy Burnham. And this isn't a criticism of Andy Burnham. I think, he's an attractive figure, politically and as a communicator, and what he's achieved in Manchester as well. But I just cannot see the path to him becoming an MP before there's a leadership election. So it's not just about becoming an MP, it's about the timetable. So if it's not Andy Burnham, then who are the candidates? Wes Streeting is, how can I put this? He will bend to the wind. I think all that matters to Wes is.
I think you're very wrong there. I think you're very wrong there, Mark. I think that Wes Streeting, whereas Starmer sort of bent to the wind to an extent under Corbyn, I think Wes Streeting is the real deal when it comes to the Labour right. And anything that he's saying at the moment that makes him appear more radical is very clever positioning to see if, when the moment comes, he can become leader. But in terms of everything we've been talking about, I think Wes Streeting, I would support any candidate in the Parliamentary Labour Party against Wes Streeting, because I think that he represents the continuity of the culture.
Could he win the next general election?
No, because I think that we need to change our stance on things like economic policy and redistribution and engaging with our core voters. And I think Wes Streeting is more wedded to historically to the McSweeney camp than even Starmer.
Oh, yes. Depressing, isn't it?
Anyway, on that gallows humour, I think we've given things a good bash, and I do say I've pushed Mark on strategy because I thought that the book could have been better at striving to give us some answers, but that in no way negates my enthusiasm for recommending people should read it. But before we finish, Mark, I want to know who has inspired you. Who is it that you want to add to the Labour Left podcast Class Heroes Hall of Fame?
Because the obvious one would be Martin Jakes, editor of Marxism Today, because I worked for him. You know, he wasn't just one of the writers, but I worked for him. I worked with him. He took 3 or 4 years to persuade me to go and work for Marxism Today, and eventually he did. And I'll forever, ever be grateful for that. It was such an incredible experience. And then there would be the triumvirate of Hobsbawm, Hall, and B. Campbell, incredibly influential writers on me. And then in 79, reading Beyond the Fragments, so Lynn Siegel, Hilary Wainwright, Sheila Rowbottom, Rock Against Racism. But then I was thinking, this is class hero on the Labour Left broadcast. So I'm going to choose Mike Marquisey. And I'm going to get a little bit emotional about this because obviously he's passed away. And I'm absolutely convinced that if he lived, he would have been the most important advisor that Jeremy Corbyn would have had. And Jeremy Corbyn would have been 100 times more effective as leader of the Labour Party because they were very close friends and worked together in Islington North. But the reason why Mike was such a big influence on me is because, a bit like yourself, you know, he came from the Labour Left. You know, I didn't agree with his book on the 1980, I think it was the 83 general election, Biting the Jaws of Victory. I reread it actually for the Starmer Symptom book, but he writes wonderfully about sport. Redemption Song, his book on Muhammad Ali, Anyone But England, his book on cricket, and he wrote also about Bob Dylan. But I've got a great interest in sport. I write about sport as much as I write about politics. And we didn't agree about England, but we had such a fascinating exchange of views. He was a really warm figure. And when it came to stop the war, he organised a tour of American students and writers and activists. And their last gig was at Conway Hall in London, and they hadn't got any money. They spent every penny, and they were looking at a huge loss. And we sold a load of T-shirts that month for Stop the War, and so we handed over the money. We saved their tour, and then he came up with this idea of a football match between Iraqi and American students in London, and we produced the shirts for him, and we numbered each shirt to cages, and he's an inspirational figure, and he worked with the sort of Trotskyist left outside of the Labour Party, but he was also a very thoughtful critic of them, a very courageous critic of them, actually. But he's no longer with us, and I quite often think I wasn't a close friend or comrade. I mean, you know, we bumped into each other politically and intellectually, if you like. I quite often think, particularly in the Corbyn era, you know, I'm not having a go at Jeremy, by the way. I think he did his best, but he didn't break with Labourism, and I think Mike's whispers in the ear would have been hugely effective. So, because it's a Labour Left broadcast, I thought I would choose Mike Marquisey.
Well, you certainly know how to play to the crowd, Mark. I can't. Yeah, Mike Marquisey was one of the biggest political influences that I made. I've got a shelf full of his books, and I remember him so fondly as the best editor of Labour Left Briefing that I was involved in that there ever was. And what was it you said earlier on about we've got to make politics fun and against miserableism?
Yeah,
I can't think of any left activists that I've worked with that personified that opposition to miserableism.
yeah.
And do you know what? Do you know where the idea for this this feature came from. You might have guessed, because Mike used to, one of his features where he used to wind up and upset leading figures on the right wing of the Labour movement. Every month, Labour Briefing used to have the class traitor of the month. And he used to take people that had upset him. And he didn't just write a diatribe. He would, in the words of Keir Starmer, carry out a forensic analysis of their background, where they'd come from, and how it was outrageous that they'd done what it was that had incensed us. And they were wonderful articles. And I remember right-wingers used to say that they used to buy it to see if they were in it. And when I set up this podcast, I thought, well, I won't do class traitor of the month. I'll do class hero. So,
but he knew I came from the Marxism Today background, but we were able to bond around a sort of a particular approach to politics, and particularly around sport. And we had a different view about Englishness and patriotism and football, but we were able to have a discussion about it, an exchange. And, you know, I teach part-time. I'm a research fellow at Brighton University in sport and leisure culture. And I would always get students, I said, look, if you have a read of this book, I recommend them various books. And that was one of the books. And I've so many times a student come, he said, I'm so glad you recommended that book about Muhammad Ali. You know, and his book on cricket as well. Those two that really stand out. And he personifies that idea that Stuart Hall and Raymond Williams talk about, is culture is politics. If you've got people on your side who can write about sport and film and literature, soap operas, food, landscape, whatever, they're such effective allies, you know.
I went on holiday to Spain recently, and I thought, oh, right, I must go and see some flamenco music. And who did I turn to learn about flamenco music? A collection of essays by Mark Perryman.
Really?
Absolutely wonderful article about flamenco and its roots. And what was fascinating about Mike, cricket, he's an American. He was American, for goodness sake. But he embraced cricket with an enthusiasm that was greater than most, certainly greater than me. His two books on cricket were widely, by people that didn't agree with anything to do with his politics, saw them as great books. Great books. Which was your favourite of Mike's books then? There's some crackers, isn't there? What was your very favourite?
Definitely Redemption Song.
Oh, yeah.
Because he just explains the 60s through one of the greatest sportsmen of all time. And the two intersect so brilliantly. The two intersect so brilliantly. So you're not often, you know, I'm trying to persuade students to read it, and they do read it and they love it. And I'm saying, like, you're reading a book of political history, but you don't realise it because you're reading a book at the same time about the greatest boxer of all time. It goes back to this key point from Hall and Williams in particular, that culture is political. And this is one of the key ways, not only do you test the limits and break the limits of Labourism, that's one of the key ways you will defeat reform. And that's why Mike's a hero. You just imagine if you had him on your podcast this week.
Oh God, he'd be great. And do you know what? When you talk about Jeremy's office, Mike wrote a fantastic book where he speaks as a Jew, criticising the state of Israel.
Yeah.
If I had to name one person that could have helped navigate the discussions about Israel and anti-Semitism, Jeremy.
Absolutely.
I can't think of any better advisor he could have had.
Yeah. No, I agree with you.
And if anybody's listening to this podcast and is hearing of Mike's name for the first time, go away and read the books.
Yeah.
You get one thing out of this podcast.
You should get Liz onto your podcast.
Oh, we had Liz on.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Liz Davis it was one of the first guests that I had on the podcast.
Right.
Very long-standing close friend of mine, partner of Mike Marquisee, and they were a great team. and she launched this podcast. We'll all miss Mike. So Mark, thank you so much for that nomination. That's great. And I hope you've enjoyed this discussion.
I have.
And everybody, read the book. Don't just read it. I'll put up on the screen now Mark Perryman's email. And if you write to that email and ask him, he will come and organise a discussion about the book and what the authors have had to say for your constituency Labour Party. And what's more, I think there's a cracking offer where you share some of the proceeds when you flog your books, isn't there, Mark?
It should, in most places, cover the cost of the event. So, yeah, it's a good deal.
Mark, I'll always promise you an open discussion, lots of disagreement, lots to think about. So get him along. Have some talk politics in the Labour Party. Anyway, Mark, thanks very much for coming on the show. Hope you've enjoyed it. And
yeah, definitely.
See you in Lewis at the next political education event. Thank you very much, Mark. Goodbye.